Stephen Wolfram has been a pioneer in the development and application of computational thinking. In 2009, he released Wolfram Alpha, defining a new dimension for computation and artificial intelligence. And it's now relied on by millions of people every day to compute answers, both directly and through intelligent assistants such as Siri. Finally, he also wrote a very influential book, A New Kind of Science, in 2002, calling for an experimental approach to the nature of computation. So with no further ado, I would like to warmly welcome Stephen Wolfram for the ICCS 2020.
Well, so what I wanted to do today was to talk a little bit about my evolving thoughts about complexity that have sort of been slowly developing over the last 40 years or so, and their relation to lots of kinds of things. But first, I wanted to say how cool it is just to see this conference existing, because as was mentioned, back in the early 1980s, I spent a lot of effort trying to sort of define the field of complex systems research. And in fact, something I'm surprised anybody still remembers, but back in 1984, I happened to be at the founding workshop of the Santa Fe Institute. And so happens that the proceedings of that were about to get republished. And so the people at the Santa Fe Institute had asked me if I'd write something to go along with that republication, because it turns out I'm basically the only person under the age of 90 who was in the room, when that was going on. So in fact, just this very afternoon, I was curious to find out what I had said there. And there's an audio tape that was made of that. And let me see whether this is probably going to fail, but let me try it anyway. I found a little segment of that audio tape. There's also a transcript. Yeah, it's a long transcript of a bunch of stuff that I'm saying. But basically, the thrust of a lot of what I had to say there was the original idea of the Santa Fe Institute was, let's create a giant interdisciplinary university. And there are a lot of people who are a lot older than me who were saying, you know, when we raise $2 billion, what will we do? And I was saying, guys, if you only raise a few $1 million, maybe you should pick a specific topic. And by the way, I have this great topic that you should pick, and it's studying complex systems. But anyway, I gave a talk there, and I was just looking at the transcript this afternoon, and I picked out a little piece here which we may be able to listen to. That's and the terrible thing is to compare me from 35 years ago with me today, and we can do that.
What happens in this field? I was wondering what one can do to make the field not
hopelessly incomprehensible. I'll tell you what that was. I have the transcript, so I can tell you what that was saying. I was saying, I'm interested to see what will happen to this field. I've been wondering what one can do to make this field not have some kind of disaster. Because if you look at the history of various interdisciplinary fields like this, the prognosis is not very good. And then I go on to talk about cybernetics and the various things that happen to cybernetics, and about catastrophe theory and so on. And I was trying to define what would make this be a healthy field. So it's really cool that 35 years later, we see the field actually, a field developed. But one of the things that I thought even at the time would be one of the most important aspects of developing a healthy field is maintaining sort of a basic science in the field. If you look at mathematics, there's pure mathematics, which is a fundamental abstract pursuit of knowledge, and then there's the applications of mathematics, and maybe there's also the field of applied mathematics, which somewhere sits in between in a slightly uncomfortable place. So I was very keen that there be a basic science of complexity kind of field. I'm not sure I was totally successful, at least in the early days of pushing that. But so a question would be, what is the basic science of complexity? So let me tell kind of a story about how at least I got involved in that. So back in the day, actually when I was about 12 years old, I ran across this book. And I was really interested in what this was talking about, and in particular I was really interested in the process that the cover purported to show, although years later I discovered that actually the cover was kind of a fake, but that's a different story. That it purported to show how you you could go from something that was sort of simple and, quotes, low entropy to something that was more complicated. So I was really interested in that. And this kind of got me into using computers because I wanted to try and simulate something like this. I ended up actually coming up with a cellular automaton to simulate this back in 1973. But for silly technical reasons, that particular cellular automaton didn't do anything terribly interesting, and so I kind of ignored that whole area for a long time. And instead got interested in sort of foundations of physics, and particularly in particle physics, which was kind of the machine learning of its time, so to speak, the field that was sort of in hypergrowth, that particular one in the late 1970s. Then in doing particle physics, I ended up having to do lots of kinds of elaborate mathematical calculations, which I wasn't personally terribly good at, and that got me involved in building computer systems. And I ended up starting in 1979 building a thing called SMP, which was a forerunner of what's now mathematical Wolfram language. What was interesting to me methodologically was, what do you do when you build a computer system or computer language? Basically, you have to think about sort of all these different kinds of computations that people might want to do, and you have to kind of dig down, a little bit like a natural scientist might dig down to sort of find out what are the fundamental elements of the world. You want to dig down, to find out what are the fundamental primitives from which you can build up all these computations people can care about, and then that's what you get to implement in your language. So anyway, that's what I spent a lot of effort doing in building SMP. But after I finished that, I said, okay, well, let me actually try and use this stuff now. And I went back to thinking about questions about complexity, and that was in the beginning of the 1980s. My first thought was, okay, I know all this fancy physics. Surely all this fancy physics must be able to answer these questions about how turbulent fluids work, or how dendritic crystals grow, or how these various biological systems form the kind of complex structures they form, etc. And I tried for a while using some methods from physics and so on, and eventually decided this was not going to work. And so then the question was, okay, if that's not going to work, how can we do better? Well, I had this very useful experience of designing a computer language where you basically are just creating primitives for the world from nothing and then seeing what consequences they have. And so that kind of got me into the idea of, well, maybe there's a way that we can generalize this activity of making models that we had from things like mathematics. Maybe we can generalize that, and instead of using the particular details of mathematical equations and so on, let's just use arbitrary rules. Well, in past times, if we just say, let's just use arbitrary rules for things, there will be no kind of basis for thinking about that. But by the 1980s, there was a basis for thinking about those kinds of things, and it was computer programs. And so that got kind of into the question of, okay, so let's think about modeling things in terms of programs. So then the first question was, well, okay, if we do that, what kinds of programs might be relevant? I mean, we were used to programs that might be thousands or millions of lines long that were aimed at doing particular things we wanted to do. But if you imagine things that might be the kinds of things that go on in nature, you don't imagine that that's a program that's gazillions of lines long. You might imagine that it's probably some very simple program. So then that got me into the question of, okay, so what do simple programs actually do? Turns out pretty much nobody knew. But it was pretty easy to do experiments on that. And so, well, these days it's a lot easier to do these experiments. This is just a modern language notebook. So the first class of things that I really got into studying were cellular automata. And probably most of you by now, after 35 years, probably most of you have seen this stuff. But I'm going to talk about it anyway because it's my all-time favorite kind of piece of science. So the typical way cellular automata are set up, at least my ones, is you just have a line of cells. Let's say each cell is either black or white. And then you have a rule that says, given a particular cell and its two neighbors, what will the color of that cell be on the next step? So here's a particular rule. You can see all these different cases in the rule and what the color of the cell should be. And now let's take a look at what that rule will do, starting off from, let's say, with just one black cell at the beginning. Let's just make a picture. Okay, it's really boring. You start off with one black cell, and all that happens is you get a big black triangle. Okay, so you might say, well, simple rule, what do you expect? It's going to be a simple pattern of behavior. But let's say you change the rule a little bit. Let's say you change it to that. Just change one bit in the rule. Let's run it again. Now you get something, again, it's a little bit more complicated, but it's still fairly simple. Okay, let's try changing the rule again. Here's another one, and let's see what happens then. Okay, well now we're starting off from just one black cell, and we get something a little bit more complicated looking. Maybe we can run it longer, see whether it sort of simplifies itself. Well, if we run it for a while, we'll discover that actually, yeah, it's a very intricate pattern, but it's still a very regular nested fractal pattern. Okay, so then the question is, okay, so we might think we have some result that says if the rule is simple enough, then the behavior will somehow be correspondingly simple. But we can actually do an actual experiment, and these days it's pretty easy to do that, so let me just go ahead and do the experiment, so to speak. Let's just make a table of what happens with all rules. Let's say we go for 50 steps, and let's say we go rules from 0 to 63, numbered 0 to 63. Okay, so this is what happens for each of those different possible rules, always starting off from just one black cell. So a lot of the time, so these ones that are all striped come because the background is alternating between black and white, but pretty much most of the things that go on are pretty boring. And you keep going, there's some nested patterns. Oh, here's my all-time favorite. So this is kind of like the, turn your computational telescope out into the computational universe and see what's out there. And you don't get to see moons of Jupiter, but you get to see this. And this is my, this is rule 30 in the numbering scheme that I've used. And you keep going, and you'll find there are a few other ones. That's rule 45, another good friend. But in any case, you can say, well, what does this rule 30 thing do? Let's look at it a little bit longer. Surely you might say, well, let's look at its rule actually first. So this is the rule, and it looks very simple. But then let's look at what it actually does. So we can let's say we run it for 500 steps. Okay, let's make it a bit bigger. There's some horrible on the screen there, but okay, make it bigger. It's aliasing a bit, but you can see on the left-hand side there's a certain amount of regularity in the behavior, but many aspects of this look extremely complicated. In fact, many aspects of it look, for all practical purposes, random. If you sample just the center cell, center column of this pattern, it seems for all practical purposes random. In fact, we used it as a pseudo-random number generator in Wolfram language for about 25 years. So that's pretty weird. You start off from something like this, and you end up with something that complicated. So to me, this was a major kind of intuitional kind of surprise. It was something that I had the intuition that if you want to make something as complicated as that, you have to go to lots of effort to do it. That you can't just, that's the experience we tend to have in engineering and in general sort of human activities, that if you want to make something complicated, it takes effort to do that. But what this is showing is that out in this sort of computational universe of even very simple programs, you can sort of effortlessly produce a great deal of complexity. And I think this is sort of a fundamental fact about the world, and it's something which allows one to start to see, how nature manages to do something that it's sort of a secret that nature uses to make, for example, lots of very complicated things. Now, one thing that's sort of interesting about this is after I discovered this, it was like, okay, this is such a fundamental thing. How come people haven't known this for thousands of years? Even, the particular things I'm doing here, somebody, in ancient Babylon could perfectly well have decided to make a mosaic based on patterns like this. And what I realized is, well, actually, there are plenty of precursors of this kind of phenomenon. For example, if you look at the digits of pi, there's something where there's a fairly simple rule for generating those digits, yet once generated, they seem for all practical purposes random. Same with the distribution of primes and so on. But what you realize is that without kind of a conceptual framework for thinking about this kind of process of making complexity, that wasn't something people focused on. When it comes to looking at the distribution of primes, people were obsessed with working out the regularity of the distribution of primes, but the most obvious feature of the distribution of primes, which is its apparent randomness, was kind of ignored. So, in any case, what I kind of realized is that this picture is sort of what leads one eventually to what I have ended up sort of characterizing as a new kind of science in which sort of complexity is taken for granted. It's kind of a basic science of the computational universe, one of whose features is that complexity is easily to be found. So it's some place here. Yeah, there's the big, that 1,200-page book that I wrote, which took me 10.5 years to write, and finally came out in 2002. But so one question is, when you look at this computational universe of possible simple programs, what are the big principles that emerge about how things work in that computational universe? And for me, I sort of collected a lot of empirical observations into something I call the principle of computational equivalence, which is, I think, a very broad principle that kind of encompasses a lot of what's out there in the computational universe to understand. So what does the principle of computational equivalence say? It says, as soon as you have behavior that's not obviously simple, it will be behavior that is computationally as sophisticated as any behavior can be. So in other words, when you look at something like, well, even something like the Rule 30 of the cellular automaton, you can think of the behavior it's showing as being the running of some computation. And the question is that computation a sophisticated computation, or is that computation a simple computation? And you might have thought that as you make the rules for these systems more and more complicated, that the complexity of the computation that's being run would somehow progressively increase as you make the rules more and more complicated. But what this principle of computational equivalence says is that that's not true. That as soon as you're above some very, very low threshold, you suddenly jump up to having behavior that's sort of computationally as sophisticated as any behavior. So this is it's a sort of a bold claim, and this claim has many, many, many implications, which I can talk about. In fact, in a sense, much of what I'll have to say is sort of consequences of the principle of computational equivalence. So you can also ask things like, well, is the principle of computational equivalence true? How would one find evidence for it? So one of its consequences is that it implies that above some very low threshold, most systems will be capable of universal computation. So that means that's the idea from Alan Turing from 1936, that there exist systems which have the property that given appropriate initial conditions, given appropriate programming, they can emulate any other system. So that you can effectively run any program by, you can make a single piece of hardware that will essentially just by software be able to do any computation. And so what the principle of computational equivalence says is that all that effort that we spend to make a CPU chip with 1 billion gates in it and so on, we don't need all of that to get universal computation. In fact, universal computation should be quite ubiquitous in the computational universe. So that's something that one can slowly get evidence for that. So for example, one of these cellular automata, Rule 110, is known to be computation universal, and that was something that was in my big book. And you can see actually, if I can kind of give you some indication of why that might be true. If I just make a big something with random initial conditions, what you'll see is that Rule 110 has all these structures running around doing things. We'll hard to see what they're saying, but you can see these various structures, and you might imagine, well, those are like logic gates, and these are like signals going around. And it turns out, yes, you can actually set things up so that you can tell that that's the case. So the principle of computational equivalence implies that computation universality is a ubiquitous thing, easy to find. So for example, what about Turing machines? Like Alan Turing had a really complicated Turing machine that he set up to be the first example of universal Turing machine. So one question that I asked was, what's the very simplest possible universal Turing machine? Well, about 10 years ago, I had a conjecture about what it was. About 10 years ago, I put out a prize for somebody to either show that it was universal or wasn't. I thought it might be one of those Fermat's last theorem things that was out there as an unsolved problem for 200 years. But actually, a young chap in England, in a fairly limited amount of time, managed to prove that actually this particular Turing machine characterized by that rule is actually universal, and we know it's the simplest possible universal Turing machine because all the other ones simpler than it we know aren't universal. So this is, again, a piece of evidence for this principle of computational equivalence, that in the world of Turing machines, the simplest Turing machine that had any hope to be universal is actually universal. So, okay, well, what are the consequences of this principle of computational equivalence? So, one very obvious consequence is it's pretty easy to make a universal computer. So, for example, if you care about doing nanotechnology and making molecular scale computers, you kind of get a suggestion that instead of going and trying to take an existing computer and shrinking down all the components to be very small, you can just take things that might be just out there in the nano world, so to speak, and then figure out how to take those components and make a universal computer out of them. That's one very obvious consequence. Let me mention a less obvious consequence. So let's take, for example, actually I have a good example of this. Let me see. So let me just take a particular rule. We can kind of go out in the computational universe and look at all sorts of different rules, but here's a rule that is a typical so-called class 4 cellular automaton. We started off in a random initial condition. It makes all that kind of complicated stuff go on. So, okay, so let's start this off from some very simple initial condition. Oh, there we go. Okay, so there's one. We started off, and pretty soon it just makes some fairly simple pattern behavior. Okay, so let's try another one. Okay, that takes a little bit longer to resolve what it's going to do. Probably if I put in something kind of random here, let's make something that is like a length 30 random thing there. Okay, so now the question is, what is this going to do? So, there's a definite rule. There's a precise rule. By running this long enough, I can absolutely tell what this is going to do by just seeing what it does. But the question is, can I predict in advance what it's going to do without having to just run it? And one of the things that's sort of been a big feature of a lot of exact science is this idea of what one can call computational reducibility. The idea that the system may take a lot of effort to do what it does, but we, by being smarter and having more sophisticated mathematics or whatever else, we can jump ahead and figure out what will happen without having to go through all the steps to see what happens. But okay, well, let's take this as an example, and I can probably run this, let's say, run 2,000 steps. Okay, what's going to happen? I don't know. Well, we can probably run it, let's just run it just for fun. Let's run it for 10,000 steps. Let's see what happens. Oh, there we go. Did I that? I didn't know it was going to happen in this case. But the issue is, the point is, it turns out that in many of these systems, there's a phenomenon I call computational reducibility, which means there actually isn't a better way to figure out what's going to happen in this system than just by running it and seeing what happens. And that's something that's kind of shocking from the point of view of much of the methodology of exact science, and it's something that kind of forces upon one, the idea of simulation is something that's certainly convenient for many kinds of studies, but this kind of says simulation isn't just convenient, it's actually necessary. There's no way to work out what will happen except by explicitly running all the steps. Now, for example, what's happening here is an example of something like the Wolfram Problem. You can ask the question, what will happen in the end after even an infinite amount of time? And that can end up being undecidable. There can be no way to figure that out that can necessarily take a finite amount of time. Now, when you look at this picture, you kind of might ask yourself, what's this thing going to do? Is it going to die out? What is it kind of thinking about doing? Does it seem to have, does this thing seem to have, you might almost have the impression that this has some kind of free will about what it's going to do. If we could immediately say, oh, I'm looking at what you're doing, it's obvious you're just going to die out, it's obvious you're going to do this, you wouldn't have thought that the thing had any kind of free will. You would just say, it's a simple deterministic system, we can easily see what it's going to do. But you start realizing this is another consequence of the principle of computational equivalence, which implies computational irreducibility. It's another consequence of that you get to have sort of a way of understanding phenomena like free will, that in terms of kind of the irreducible distance between the underlying rules and the actual behavior you see. It's not the case. People imagined when they sort of thought about AI in the 1950s and 1960s, if you have a machine with simple logical principles, it will be really easy to see what it's going to do. Well, this computational irreducibility implies that that's not the case. So there are all kinds of other consequences of this principle of computational equivalence. One that, for me, is at least philosophically very important, has to do with intelligence and the nature of intelligence. Because the principle of computational equivalence kind of says there isn't a bright line. It says there's a computational equivalence between all these different systems out there in the world that might be doing things that are computation-like, including things like our brains. It says there really isn't any difference between the kinds of processes that are going on in our brains and the kinds of processes that are going on in these simple computational systems or in systems in nature. So, for example, that leads to things like, people, there's a common saying, the weather has a mind of its own, which people think, oh, that's an ancient animistic view of the world. But actually, there's some science to it as well, we now realize, because the weather is determined by these processes of fluid mechanics and so on and so on and so on. And the issue is, from a computational point of view, how do those fluid mechanics processes compare to the processes going on in our brains? And what the principle of computational equivalence says is actually they're equivalent. And so that means that, for example, there's computational irreducibility because our brains can't sort of jump ahead. They're the same level of computational sophistication. They can't kind of accelerate ahead of what's going to happen in something like the weather. So this means that we end up with thinking about all these different processes. For example, we think about extraterrestrial intelligence, and we ask the question, where is there intelligence in the universe? It's surprising we haven't run into any of it. Well, what you realize quite quickly, I think, is that there actually is plenty of intelligence in the universe. It's just in the form of these types of computation, but like the weather, it's intelligence or it's sort of sophisticated computation that is not, that we don't recognize as intelligence because it's not aligned with kind of the way that the kinds of goals and purposes that we have and the ways that we think about how things imagine intending what they're going to do. So, well, just to, I could talk a little bit more about that whole issue in a moment, but I just mentioned one thing about the computational universe and about its importance for technology. So if we think about what is technology, technology is basically about taking things that exist in the world, maybe they're materials, maybe they're other kinds of things, and somehow applying them for human purposes. We discover magnetic materials, we discover we can make compasses out of them, we discover liquid crystals, we discover we can make computer displays out of them. There are all these things that exist in the material world, the physical world, and we've found ways through technology to harness them for human purposes. Well, what I kind of realized a long time ago is this computational universe is an infinite supply, has an infinite supply of harnessable stuff that we can turn into technology. And usually when you write a program, you say, well, I'm going to build this program up step by step, and I'm going to imagine what it's going to do every step of the way. I'm going to sort of engineer it in the way that we're used to doing engineering. But actually, there's a quite different approach to engineering that one can take, which is to just say, let's define our requirements, and then let's just go search the computational universe and see if we can find a program out in the computational universe that satisfies these requirements. And we've been doing this now for 20 years or so at our company, for example, and a lot of things that are inside Wolfram language, a lot of the algorithms, the Wolfram alpha and things, were actually not created by humans. They were found by essentially searching the computational universe. And it's a kind of a humbling experience because you find these things and you look at them and you can see they work, and you say, how does this work? And you realize this, if you can figure it out, you realize this is really very clever. Well, it was clever, but it wasn't human cleverness that got you. But I think that this is this idea of mining the computational universe for useful computational stuff, and even stuff that can be turned into real physical objects and so on, is an important direction, and it's actually sort of the future of engineering. And my expectation is that within probably not that many decades, the vast majority of engineering that will be done by essentially mining the computational universe, not by building things up step by step. And actually, in recent times, with modern machine learning and neural nets and so on, it's a great example of sort of the beginnings of that kind of process. Neural nets have the feature that, unlike cellular automata, they have an understanding of sort of how you apply calculus and how you can make incremental changes. We don't yet quite know enough about the geometry of cellular automata ruled space to be able to do the same kind of thing there. My guess is eventually we will. For now, we're stuck with dealing with these kind of real number, sort of traditional calculus kind of approaches, but that's a case where we're essentially mining this computational universe of possible neural nets to find ones that are useful for our particular purposes. Well, so my kind of, actually, let me mention one other thing, which is when it comes to making models of things, One of the things that's really interesting that's happened in the last probably 15 or 20 years is it's sort of a consequence of the realization of complexity being an important thing, among other things, is, okay, for 300 years, there was, if you were going to do exact science and you were going to make a model of something, if you wanted to make a serious model, you would have to be writing down some mathematical equation, some differential equation, something like that. That was kind of the test for were you really making a model of something. Of course, when Galileo and Newton and so on were doing this, they were in the transition phase when it had gone from having essentially mechanistic models of things to mathematical models of things. But the thing that's really pretty exciting is for 300 years, kind of mathematical equations have dominated the story of modeling. But in the last 15 or 20 years, there's silently been a complete revolution that's happened, which is if you look at new models of things that people make, they're essentially all made in terms of programs and not in terms of mathematical equations. So after 300 years of dominance of mathematical equations, we've seen a remarkably rapid shift to programs being made, to models being made primarily in terms of programs. And it's kind of exciting to see that, and it kind of reveals that if there is a basic science of complexity, that is the thing that should be applied as the way to understand all of these things that are being modeled in this kind of new way with programs. But in any case, so my kind of view of the computational universe and complexity and all that is, out in the computational universe, there's this sort of amazing ocean of capabilities that exist in terms of all the programs and all the things they do. So now the question is, okay, well, how do we humans interact with that? And so the thing one realizes is there's all this computational ability out there, and then there's us thinking about what we want to do. And the question is, how do you bridge between the us thinking about what we want to do and the computational capabilities that exist out there? And what you realize is that you need some kind of language to express in a preferably precise way what it is we want to do, and somehow be able to get the ideas in that language executed as automatically as possible over in this computational universe. Well, yes, I think that's a worthwhile way to think about things, and conveniently I've spent the last 40 years of my life basically trying to build tools that provide that bridge, that provide a language that can go from the way humans are thinking about stuff to the way that the computational universe can execute things. And it's, I've spent the thing that I've made is Wolfram language, and which is what emerged from Mathematica and Wolfram Alpha and so on. And kind of as was mentioned, we just celebrated our 30th anniversary on June 23rd, just about a month ago, June 23rd of this year. Actually, the really big news for me was that I managed to get a version 1 program running on a very old Macintosh, and I took the version 1 program that I wrote a notebook on the version 1 program on Macintosh, and then I took it with a lot of floppy disk effort and so on to a version 11.3 Wolfram language, and it just ran. The strength of the ideas was such that we were able to maintain compatibility over that long period of time. But in any case, and over that period of time, though, that's sort of the comparison between 1988 and today of this sort of original version of Wolfram language and Mathematica, which was very much oriented towards sort of math kinds of things, and the modern version that has an awful lot else. But in any case, how do I think about this kind of language and its role in sort of the computational world? Basically, the thing that, okay, so this is now at sort of a practical level, if we, when there were more computers, when there were first electronic computers in the 40s and the 50s, it was just, here's a computer, go program it in machine code. And then the very early languages like Fortran and COBOL and so on emerged, and you kind of started to take it for granted that there would be some kind of low-level language that you could use to program a computer. And then operating systems emerged, and much later user interfaces emerged, and kind of network connectivity and so on emerged. And kind of progressively over the years, there are these layers, ubiquitous layers of computation that you can kind of take for granted in making use of computers. And as far as I'm concerned, what we're trying to do with Wolfram language is to make kind of a ubiquitous layer of computational intelligence that you can take for granted in using computers. So it's something where, in addition to your computer knowing, being able to do basic things, your computer will intrinsically know, things about, I don't know, we could let's say, make a random graph with 200, something like that, and your computer will intrinsically know, how to figure out, let's say, the communities in that graph, or your computer will intrinsically know, let's say, let's try this, something like, what are the capital cities in Europe? It will intrinsically know what those are. It will have kind of the knowledge of the world built into it. And this is something that we can kind of expect to take for granted when we walk up to a computer. And that's kind of my goal, is to have this layer of kind of computational intelligence that both knows sort of algorithms about how to do things and knows actual knowledge about the world that we can take for granted as we try and build whatever we can build. Now, obviously, and in a sense, the language that we have is the link between sort of the human ideas about what we want to do and the computational ability of our machines to be able to do it. So there's lots of implications of having such a language. I'll just mention kind of one of the sort of emerging future directions. So one of the questions is, we can express lots of kinds of things in this language. We can talk about places, foods, movies, mathematical constructs, all kinds of things we can talk about in the language, and we know a lot about them. One of my goals is to be able to talk about everything in the language. And actually, for a long time I thought that would be a cool thing to be able to do, but what would anybody use those things for? But then I realized, and in recent times it's become clear what the answer is. The answer is, and it's sort of emerged from the blockchain kind of world, the answer is, if you want to make computational contracts, you need to be able to talk about everything in the world. So what that means is, smart contracts tend to be these things that are very specifically tied to blockchains. But let's talk about the more general concept of computational contracts, which means, two parties decide we want the following things to happen in the world, and if those happen, this happens, and so on. How do we describe those contracts today? Well, we write them in, not quite English, we write them in legalese, because we want something that's a bit more precise than English. But what if we could write those contracts actually in code, in some computational language that can actually express things in the world? Well, this idea of doing that is a really old idea. Like Gottfried Leibniz had this idea in the 1600s. And he had this notion, his original goal was, let's get rid of sort of human lawyers and so on. Let's just have a universal language in which we can express everything, and purely by logic, and in his time, brass calculating machines, work out what the answer to every kind of legal case should be. Well, he was 300 years too early in trying to build what I would now call the symbolic discourse language. It's kind of a lesson for people like me who like to think about the future and so on, is don't think about things that can't be done for 300 more years. But in any case, in Leibniz's time, there was quite an effort to build what were in those days called philosophical languages. Languages which could express ideas independent of the details of human language. But now we can actually do this. And now we're in the process of building kind of a symbolic discourse language which allows one to create computational contracts which connect to things like blockchains and so on. Blockchains are kind of one particular way of implementing a certain level of computational contract, probably not the smallest ones and not the biggest ones, but some intermediate ones. Actually, it's been, one reason we can sort of thrust in the middle of that is that when you try and make smart contracts and things like that, you need to have an oracle that says what actually happened in the world. If you're making, weather insurance or something, you need to know, did it actually rain? Well, it turns out that our Wolfram Alpha system is basically by a long way the most complete sort of source of computable knowledge that exists in the world. And so basically everybody who's trying to make those kinds of oracles is using it for that purpose. And we realize there's a lot more that you can do along those lines to do with IoT devices and validating what happens in the world, trying to make models of the world that validate that a particular piece of input from an IoT device is correct, or alternatively using machine learning to detect anomalies, etc., etc., etc. Anyway, so actually one of the things so when you think about these computational contracts, One of the things that they also bring one into is questions about, so what do we really want the AIs to do? You know, what ethics do we want the AIs to have, all those kinds of things. And so one of the questions is, well, you could say, you start realizing that the computational contracts are what we have to write to tell the AIs what we generally want them to do. And we need some language to express what it is we want the AIs to do, something that we humans understand, and something that can then express those ideas for purposes of AIs. And I think what I've kind of realized is ultimately one of the more important types of computational contracts that us humans have to write is kind of the constitution, or probably many constitutions for the AIs, so to speak, that define in general terms what the AIs should do. Sort of an inevitable thing. You might think, oh, can we write down, Asimov's laws of robotics and make some very compact description of, there's just one rule, and if the AIs just do that, everything will be good. I think we know from actually computational reducibility and things like Little's theorem, we kind of know that that's never going to work. That you say, I want these constraints, and it turns out there will always be some unexpected consequences when you try and define a set of constraints about what's going on. So we'll end up, rather unsurprisingly perhaps, with an AI constitution that's big and complicated and messy, much like the legal systems of the world, taking account of lots of different kinds of things which actually won't be noticed, but which are sort of computationally irreducible to notice. Well, okay, so just a few more things to mention. I mean, I think that I talked about using models, making models using programs. One of the things that's interesting in the computational universe is, okay, well, there's a particular universe that we care a lot about, which is the one we live in, the physical universe. And the question is our physical universe out there to be found in the computational universe? That is, if the computational universe represents all possible sets of rules, are the rules that correspond to our physical universe to be found somewhere there? You might say, well, maybe the rules for our universe must be very complicated. It must be, have millions of lines of code effectively in it to describe how it works. Maybe, but it's certainly not obvious that that should be the case. And the principle of computational equivalence kind of shows you, you can get a lot of very complicated stuff with very simple rules. So that kind of leads one to the question, okay, so what actually are the rules for our universe like? And I've been interested in this for a long time. I started life as a physicist, so I'm kind of primed for that type of question. But so I've been interested in kind of, if the rules for our universe are really small, what might they be like? And one of the things you realize is, if the rules are really small, the things we know about the universe can't be immediately evident in those rules. So for example, we don't get to put that the mass of the muon is 206 times the mass of the electron. We've only got 2 or 3 lines of code. We don't get to put that number 206 anywhere in there. In fact, we don't probably even get to put the number 3 for the number of dimensions of space in there. Everything that exists in the universe has to somehow emerge from some much simpler set of underlying rules. And so the question is then, what is there? What might the underlying rules be like? They must be something that sort of live underneath things like space and time that we're familiar with. Well, my favorite version of how to set that up, and there may be many others, but this one is kind of my favorite way of setting this up is to think about space as just corresponding to a network. And this particular network is obviously drawn in 3-dimensional space, but all that matters, or might matter about the network that might correspond to what's underneath space and time, is just there are nodes and there are connections. Well, some networks you can easily lay them out in 2 dimensions. Other networks, you can easily lay them out in 3 dimensions. Other networks, maybe they're infinite dimensional. The point is if one is looking at what's underneath space and time, my best guess of the way to represent that, and there are some alternatives, but this is the one that's most human understandable, is to think about it as a network. And you say, well, how does space and time emerge from this? Well, it's kind of like if you have a glass of water, you think of water as being a continuous fluid, but actually the water is made of a bunch of discrete molecules bouncing around. It's only on a large scale that it seems to be something continuous. And it's the same thing here, that from all these discrete points on a large scale emerges something which appears continuous. It's kind of ironic, I think, that some progress was made in physics by realizing that, like Euclid's fifth postulate, the 2 parallel lines never cross, wasn't necessarily true of physical space. That was sort of an original idea that led to things like non-relativity. I think that actually, in the end, my guess is that the very first common notion in Euclid, the fact that a point is a thing that has no part, which is a statement of the continuity of space, is actually wrong. And that understanding that, I mean, the current theories that we have in physics, general relativity and quantum field theory, are both basically 100 years old. I think we kind of need something new and different to make progress. But in any case, what you can do, given that if you start off thinking about sort of what's underneath space and time and something like a network, you say, well, what rules might this network satisfy? And you start studying all possible rules, and you discover quite quickly that there's some very exciting things that happen. For example, you discover that large parcels of these rules imply relativity. So they first imply special relativity, and then more excitingly, they imply general relativity. You can derive, much as you can derive the continuum equations of fluid mechanics from this discrete molecular dynamics. So you can similarly derive the Einstein equations for gravitation from the sort of discrete dynamics of these networks. And one of the things that surprised me, actually, was I thought we would have to search a billion networks to find ones that weren't obviously, hopelessly not our universe. So it turns out you only need to go maybe 1,000 networks before you, 1,000 rules, network rules, before you get to ones where the thing does something very complicated. You grow it for a billion steps, it's flapping around, it's doing all kinds of things, and I can't say at least that the thing I've got isn't in fact our universe. It may be, it may not be, but I can't tell. Now, of course, computational irreducibility puts a bit of a problem in the whole thing, because it might be that to tell what's going to happen in this universe, you actually have to run it for a gazillion steps to actually simulate the whole 14 billion years of evolution that we've seen. But one can hope that one can kind of jump ahead to discover some things. And in fact, one of the features of computational irreducibility is that there are always inevitably lumps of computational reducibility inside any system that shows computational irreducibility. And if we're lucky, we can kind of grab onto some of those lumps of computational reducibility to actually find out things we recognize about physics from one of these underlying models. So one of the things that's sort of interesting about that is to ask questions about, okay, well, if we've got some system that shows computational irreducibility, how can we make science about it? Because often when we do science, we want to have kind of a description. We want to have a human way to talk about what's going on in the system. So, for example, when you think about a science of almost anything, let's say a science of linguistics, well, it's all well and good. We might one day have a theory where we can, say what every neuron firing in the brain does, and the result of simulating those neuron firings might be that the next word I say is yes, for example. But the question is, if we want to make a science of linguistics in the traditional way we thought about that, it's not really good enough just to say, well, we'll just simulate it and see what happens. We'd like to be able to tell more of a human story about why something happened. So the question is, when is there explainability? When is there something where we can make a science out of stuff? And it's interesting to see, perhaps, an example, So this is an example from mathematics, actually. So there's one thing I did 20 years ago or so now. I was curious in this whole question about what's the simplest such and such that does such and such. I was interested in, if you look at all possible axiom systems for mathematics, so actual mathematics as it's practiced, you can fit all the axioms that are used on one page, which I did in my book, needless to say. But the question is, where do those axioms lie in the space of all possible axiom systems? So we've studied particular axiom systems in the human history of mathematics, but what's out there in the whole space of possible axiom systems? And to kind of start to address that, I was curious, if we take like logic, Boolean algebra, what is the simplest possible axiom system for Boolean algebra? And how quickly would you find an axiom system for Boolean algebra? You just start scanning all possible axiom systems. So this turns out to be the thing I found 20 years ago now. It is the simplest axiom system for Boolean algebra. The dot can be thought of as a NAND operation, and actually nowadays we can, hopefully. We can actually, in Wolfram language, we can actually generate a proof of this. So we can say, let's look at the proof network. So this is a graph that shows the lemmas that were used in proving this result. It takes 102 steps to prove. This is proving the commutativity of NAND from the axiom system for Boolean algebra. So it's a big, complicated mess. And if we could say, let's say, we could say, well, what's actually, what is that proof? Just write down that proof. Let's see what we have. I just said proof notebook here. Okay, so this is a version of that proof that's been written out. And here's the problem with this proof. It's absolutely incomprehensible. For 20 years, I've been curious, what on earth does this proof actually say? I have no idea. It's easy to verify it. Every step is easy to understand. But the whole picture is simply one can't grasp it. And the question is, so what's going on here? Is it the case? Is this in fact an explainable result, or is it not? Is it something that is out there in the space of mathematical results, but not something that we humans can get our arms around, perhaps ever? So that leads one to kind of asking questions. Well, there are some analogous kinds of questions that quickly come up. So in modern machine learning, let's do an example of modern machine learning. Let's just get let's do something here. Let's get an image here. Go. The image, so now let's say, if I say image identified, so now I'm going to use some modern machine learning capabilities. Hopefully, let's see what will happen. I might have to load some neural nets here. Let's see what's happening. I'll probably say something really silly. Okay, it said this. So you might ask, what's actually going on inside here? Well, okay, we can actually look in the language, we can look at the network, the neural net that is actually doing that. So here it is, and you can dig down and you can see all sorts of details in here. And if we apply that neural net to that picture, it should give us, that it's running all these different layers of everything. Oh my gosh, okay, great. Well, that one, that's interesting. That was the way that it picks its top one. Let's see. All 10. Let's say, let's ask it to tell us the probabilities. This will work. What I need to do is ask it to show us here what probabilities. Okay, so what that did was it decided, rather embarrassingly, that isn't actually a person. That network concluded something rather silly. Let's say, okay, so here we go. These are the probabilities that it gave. This version of that network concluded something different. But let's do the following. Let's just look at what the network was thinking inside. So let's just take the first 10 levels of the network, and let's see what they generate. And let's look inside the brain of the neural net. Let's see what it actually was doing. Okay, so there it's got all its various kinds of versions of things that it was looking at, and we can maybe say, make a feature space plot of these, and then see if we can try and tell anything about what's going on, what the neural net is thinking. Well, okay, we can't actually tell very much. This feature space plot probably just distinguished lighter and darker pictures and so on. But the question that we can ask ourselves is, what was this neural net thinking inside? How did it come up with what it came up with? And one of the things and this again, is like the proof question, what are the lemmas, what are the waypoints that are being used inside this neural network to decide what it's going to do? I kind of view it this way. If this neural net was, the question is, what sort of higher level concepts does the neural net use to figure out what it's going to do? You can think of the neural net in some sense as playing like a game of 20 questions, Is this a picture of a person, or is it a picture of is it a person-like thing, or is it a car-like thing? Does it have, this color, that color? It's kind of branching down and trying to figure out things based on certain features that it's noticing. And the question is, how does one describe those features? In the first few levels of the neural net, we can notice that there are things that we have names for, edge detection, things like this. But as we get deeper into the neural net, we don't have names for these kinds of things. But maybe we could. Maybe the neural net, after it looked at enough pictures of the world, has concluded some very interesting things about the world. Maybe it's discovered something like fractal dimensions in the world. Maybe it's discovered some other kinds of things. It's discovered some distinctions to make in the world which are useful for describing the world, but which we humans haven't yet come up with words for. And so one of the things one realizes is, I've been thinking a bunch about this recently, is kind of what's sort of the theory of abstraction. In other words, what has to happen is you have a whole bunch of specific examples of neural nets doing this and that and the other, but what you want is to form concepts that represent abstractly big classes of those things. And sort of in English we maybe have 30,000 words that we commonly use. Maybe inside the neural net, the AI just figured out 1 million more words that are useful for describing the world. Now, it's a really complicated thing as we start thinking about kind of the ways that we describe the world and the invention of kind of abstractions for describing the world. In language, we have words. In mathematics, we have various kinds of concepts and theories and so on. In mathematics, it's a little bit more obvious sometimes how the hierarchy builds up to go from elementary arithmetic through algebra through all kinds of other things. In human language, we similarly have sort of a hierarchy of ideas. And what's a little bit complicated is this kind of interplay between the ideas we have and the way we set up our world. Because, back in the day, probably in the Stone Age, there probably wasn't a word for table. But eventually people started doing things which were table-like, and eventually it became useful to abstract all those table-like things and decide that there should be a word for table. So there was a word for table. Once there's a word for table, people start doing all kinds of things with tables. And so similarly, in what we realize is there's this kind of feedback loop between our abstractions of the world and the ways that we build things in the world. And we choose when we build things, we build a room that's rectangular, it has sort of a cuboidal shape. We build things that we are somehow familiar with. And there's sort of this feedback loop, and then we start doing things in terms of the things that we're familiar with. So there's this feedback loop between how we abstract things, how we build things, how that building leads to our further abstractions and so on. I think I kind of realized in this sort of loop, the business of language design, which, as I say, happens to be the business that I've spent most of my life on, is it's kind of at some level I realized why it might be an important business, because language design is all about kind of trying to define the right abstractions that allow you to think in the right ways about things. And so, my goal, like with Wolfram Language, is to make it possible for people to think in the best possible way about computation. I view the purpose of a language as much as anything as a computational communication language, a language where you can express computational thoughts in an effective way, in a way that not only computers can understand those computational thoughts, but also humans can understand those computational thoughts. I kind of view an interesting direction these days. I like thinking about computational essays as a way to kind of, as a great way to communicate ideas, because it's something where, you have a few words, and then, not able to type it, but you have a few words, but you also have pieces of code, and the code is clear enough and human understandable enough that it is part of the communication process. I like to call this computational essays. And I think they're sort of the future of journals and other kinds of things. These computational essays which mix kind of textual explanation with code-type explanation in this computational communication language that we've built. And I think it's an interesting thing to think about. If there is real literacy in this computational communication language, what happens? Literacy in plain natural language is sort of about 500 years old, and it led to all kinds of important changes in the way the world is set up. In a world where there is computational literacy, what happens? Like, for example, this doesn't work, but it's an amusing idea. You say in a democracy, people are voting for this or that, and there's like a multiple choice voting kind of thing, where you say, I want this or that. Well, what if everybody could just write a computational essay that was just a piece of code that says, this is how I want the world to be. And then you could, collect together, a couple 100 million of those things, and then say, okay, now we're going to figure out from this what the world should now be like. Now, of course, you're immediately thrust into the classic problems of political philosophy, because it's kind of like, okay, what are we actually trying to achieve, given that these are all the preferences and so on. So in any case, This whole question about how we think about abstraction, it's important for lots of purposes. Like, for example, here's another one about education. So, one of the things that's been exciting for me about Wolfram language in recent times is it's narrowed the gap between what the fanciest researchers can do and what a random middle school kid can do. And it's now to the point where a random middle school kid, and I've done this a bunch, it's kind of fun, doing the field experiments with actual kids, it's kind of, they're kind of shockingly efficient at understanding sort of the principles of something like our language and being able to start actually thinking computationally in terms of the language. But a question that comes up about education in general is, okay, so what do we need to teach? Is there more and more and more knowledge in the world so that gradually over the course of time there's just more and more and more and more to teach? Or is that not how it's going to work? Because as things get automated and abstracted, there are things we don't have to teach anymore. Like, for example, people, we've obviously built tools that let people deal with the mechanics of mathematical computations and things like that. And so there are a lot of things that we can now think of as being sort of automated away. And one of the things that's interesting as we think about this kind of successive layers of abstraction is as we can abstract things away, we don't need to teach the details of what's underneath anymore. So my kind of, one question is, as we go forward in sort of history, is the frontier of what we need to teach the humans about, is it going to expand? Is it perhaps going to contract? Or is it going to stay about the same? But in any case, the other question that comes up is, as we look out in the sort of computational universe, is there always more interesting stuff? So for example, in mathematics, there's an infinite number of theorems you could prove. There's about 3 million that have been written down in the literature of mathematics so far in history. The question is, have all the interesting theorems been discovered? There obviously are an infinite number of possible theorems, but have the interesting ones been discovered? Well, what you realize is that's all about these questions about abstraction and so on, because what counts as an interesting theorem is something that is it's sort of a theorem about which, more or less, it's a theorem about which you can tell a story, about which there's some kind of human connection, rather than just a random theorem out there in the space of possible mathematical theorems. Well, so I'm coming more or less at the end of what I want to say, but I want to talk a little bit about kind of the role of the future of the human condition and so on, and the role of complexity and AI and so on in defining that. So one of the things that people ask, okay, there are AIs and there's going to be, there's this sort of progression of increasing automation that is the long time story of technology, and AI is perhaps accelerating that in certain ways. The question is, what will be left for the humans to do? And so you imagine the AI, the box on the desk, and it's doing everything that, can it do everything? Well, what you realize is, first thing is, it is not the case that we are with our AIs and our computation achieving something that's never been achieved before. According to the principle of computational equivalence, there's sophisticated computation all over the universe. We're not achieving something special by having created the computation we've created and the kinds of things we can do with AI. That's ubiquitous. So the question is, what is special about what we have? What we realize is, what's special about what we have is as it connects to human goals and human purposes. And when we say, well, what can be automated? You can automate getting stuff done, but you can't automate knowing what stuff you want to do. So, for example, as we have a GPS that tells us where to go from here to there, but we're still picking kind of where we want to go. And I'm saying this, that when you think about it, is there a mathematical theory of ultimate purpose? The answer is no. It's almost a meaningless idea. In other words, we can have a mathematical theory of the best, the most optimal way to achieve such and such a goal, but there's no definition of what the goal is supposed to be. That's something that purely comes from the details of our particular history, our particular civilization, our particular biological history, etc., etc., etc. That's something that is necessarily unique to us humans. And I think that that's and so when so now let's imagine, we have the future of technology and so on, and we've successfully reproduced, for example, human consciousness in digital form, which certainly will happen. And in the end, we've uploaded, a trillion souls to some box somewhere. And so then the question is, well, what happens inside this box? You say, this is a very special box. It's the whole of humanity is in this box. There's something very special about it. You look at it and you say, well, there's all kinds of computations going on inside this box, but you know there's a rock right next to this box, and it's got all kinds of computations going on in it too. And it's got all these electrons, and they're doing all kinds of things, and they're running quantum mechanics, and they're doing all this stuff. So the question is, what's different between the rock and the box of a trillion human souls? And the answer, I think the only real answer is that the box of a trillion human souls has kind of the future trajectory of kind of human goals and human purposes and human history in it. And that's what makes it special. It's not that it has some unique computational ability, it's that it is an encapsulation of our kind of computationally irreducible history. Well, so one of the things that I've kind of wondered about is okay, it's a kind of a bad picture for sort of the future of humanity, that in the end, there's just this box of a trillion souls, and what's happening in that box? Well, it's kind of, it's disembodied humans playing video games for the rest of eternity. That's kind of the bad case scenario. It seems like it's the bad case scenario. Actually, the more bizarre version of that scenario is, okay, for a while you play video games in the actual universe as it is, and then you realize, forget this physical universe. It doesn't really matter it doesn't even matter what the rules for the physical universe are. Everything is virtualized. It's kind of a shame for those of us who are interested in physics and really care about figuring out the rules for the universe, because actually the disembodied souls don't care about the rules for the universe because they're just dealing with a virtualized universe. And then you start thinking, well, maybe what happens is the disembodied souls, they forget about the actual universe. They start exploring the computational universe of all possible universes. Because that's kind of what's out there. And so for me, that's sort of a bizarre claim, because it's like my new kind of science efforts and so on. It's kind of like my projection for the future of humanity, which is very much like, what kind of hammer is this particular person going to come up with? But it's kind of like the extreme cases. Maybe what ends up happening to the future of humanity is it's all about exploring the computational universe of all possible universes in the same kind of way that I've tried to do in things like nuclear science. But anyway, for a while I was very sort of depressed about what does it mean to have, by the time there's a bunch of disembodied human souls playing video games for the rest of eternity with computations that are similar to what happens on the rock. That seems like, this is a bad case. So then I started thinking, well, okay, let's imagine, we have certain human goals and purposes that we think are really important today. Let's imagine that we went back 1,000 years and we told somebody from 1,000 years ago what we do today. Well, a lot of what we do today would seem completely pointless. I mean, I walked on a treadmill for an hour today. What on earth? What a stupid thing to do. So what I realized is that the thing that makes it a little more palatable to think about the future in this way is that what I realized is that at any time in human history, there has been a local purpose that people have found perfectly meaningful. It is not necessarily a purpose that withstands sort of the course of history. I mean, we see that. I've been interested in sort of communicating with extraterrestrials and also communicating across time, and you realize that there are many archaeological artifacts and so on where we have no idea 1,000 years later or 2,000 years later or whatever what this thing was for. It was very meaningful at the time, but we have no idea what that purpose was not communicated across that period of history. So I kind of started to feel a little better about the future, that kind of future, because I think to those disembodied souls in the box, inevitably what will happen will seem as meaningful as the kinds of things that we do today are. I think one of the things, perhaps, and I should finish, I'm sorry I've gone on a bit long, but one of the things that's perhaps interesting is to think about as we look at, so I've been curious about sort of the evolution of human purposes, the relation of that to this kind of theory of abstraction and so on, and questions about what can one say about kind of the limiting path of the way that human purposes and abstraction are closely related, are linked. But in general, one of the things to realize is that in almost any of these, what one thinks about in these scenarios, for the future of science, technology, the human condition and so on, turns out there's one story that's in the middle of those things, and it's basically the story of complexity. It's whether we are dealing with sort of the future of science and trying to break out of the methodologies that we have today for studying ideas in science, whether we're trying to figure out in technology how to make kind of the optimal use of the computational universe resources that exist, or whether we're thinking about kind of the human condition and we're thinking about kind of what the trajectory of its future ends up being. Turns out, looks like this complexity thing that seems like all of us here care about is pretty central to all those things. So anyway, I should stop there. Thanks very much.
So I'm sure there will be an avalanche of questions after this very fascinating talk. So let me open actually. But
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. In our real world, even if there are simple rules to begin with, there are new rules appearing, such as there is a table. I interact with this table not as a bunch of atoms, but as a table. How do you map that back to cellular automata? Have you seen new rules appear, new entities appear?
Right. Well, so that's a very interesting question, and that relates again to this whole question about sort of the notion of abstraction. So, for example, in something like this, even though there's a single underlying rule, there are things appearing. There are structures that appear. Maybe one of these like a table, who knows. The question is, can we have an effective theory that describes those things without having to go all the way back to talking about the bits underneath? And that relates very much to this question about abstraction. Is there a way of talking about, we could treat every number on its own, or we could have the idea of integers, the idea that there is an arbitrary number, n, where we could say things about it. So I think that's now, when you say, what about, why don't you just inject more cellular automata rules to help with that process? It doesn't really help. That's what the principle of computational equivalence says. It doesn't really matter. You can put, the underlying rules will be enough to give you a great deal of richness. The question in terms of description is more a question of what kind of effective theory can you make. If you have a question, back to that. Yeah, first.
So Claude Shannon explained how in a digital system energy is spent to maintain the discreteness of evolving states. If we describe an analog system as a system that doesn't do that, does a cellular automaton have meaning in a fully analog context?
Okay, so one of the things I was curious about was, cellular automata are discrete systems. The question is, how much of the world is genuinely discrete versus actually continuous? If I'm right about physics, we're going to discover it's all ultimately discrete, but it's a long way down. Traditional physics, you look very quizzical, but physics for the last 100 years has been really convinced that the universe is continuous. When quantum mechanics was young, people were pretty sure everything would turn out to be discrete, space and time and everything. Turns out people didn't manage to make consistent theories that did that. Actually, even Einstein, later in his life, said, in the end it's going to turn out to be discrete, but we don't have the tools to study this yet. It's the question of whether the universe is truly continuous is certainly an open question. I think it probably isn't, but here's a thing you can look at. So given that you understand this phenomenon of sort of that you can make phenomena like the phenomena I'm showing in cellular automata, you can ask the question, does that happen in more continuous systems? So the sort of most extreme continuous system people look at is partial differential equations, which are kind of the raw material of lots of mathematical modeling. And these are some typical partial differential equations, diffusion equation, wave equation, the more exotic sine coordinate equation. So one thing I was interested in, given that we now know about things like Rule 30 and cellular automata and so on, are there similar phenomena that happen in these completely continuous, quotes, analog systems? Now, okay, so it turns out needless to say, I did a big search of these things, and it didn't take me very long to find these nonlinear wave equations where you start them off from just a Gaussian initial condition, and they curl up and make all this complicated stuff. Now, what you might have said when you first, we've used these equations as tests of our numerical partial differential equation solving capabilities for a long time. And here's the problem with these continuous systems. On a computer, we don't really actually know what they do. we end up discretizing them, we end up having, we change the mesh size, we use these methods, but until we can get, as soon as there's computational irreducibility, basically, we can't expect to have a closed-form solution, and we don't have it. And so if we'd never seen the cellular automaton phenomenon, we would have been worrying, oh my gosh, that probably isn't right, how could it be so complicated? It must be a glitch in my numerical analysis. Now that we know that this phenomenon exists from kind of discrete systems, we can, turns out, we can go find it easily in continuous systems. There's much more to study about this, but certainly the same phenomena exist in continuous systems.
I'm just curious. So let's say if I want to find a rule that can compute certain knowledge, at a certain point, I will try to find a rule that will solve problems that involve the knowledge of the problem, the program itself. So when this gets complicated, the self-knowledge of this particular rule may prove to be of some utility as for human social interaction that we have self-knowledge. So do you ever explore the possibility of finding rules with self-knowledge, whatever that means?
Right, so I guess in my time as a language designer, one of the things that's been important is our Wolfram language is a symbolic language. It uses symbols, symbolic expressions to represent anything. Among the things it can represent are itself. And indeed, it's very important to be able to use the symbolic expressions that, it can be a symbolic expression that represents a city, or a symbolic expression that represents a graph, or whatever, or a symbolic expression that represents a program. And actually, one of the things that's sort of a frontier for us is using our language to reason about itself, so to speak. And it's, there are many things that one would like to be able to do. For example, so I think that's my version of kind of self-knowledge, is to have a language that can reason about itself. Many things. For example, here's an example. One we care about right now is program simplification. So you've got a program and it does something, and it isn't the simplest program it could be. It's a program that's trying to achieve some purpose, but it's doing it in some very ornate kind of way. And it's always interesting to understand what is the. Here, let me show you an example that's kind of interesting in that regard, perhaps. Let's see, like it. So, this is just, actually, this relates to the question of can you tell if something has a purpose? It's a slightly different question, but perhaps it's interesting. So these are examples of cellular automata that all achieve the purpose of doubling the size of their input. So if you give them n black cells at the beginning, they'll eventually have 2 n black cells at the end. But what you see is lots of different solutions to that problem, including ones that are really incredibly ornate. And so one of the questions this sort of relates to the question, how do you tell if a thing has a purpose? And sort of interesting to see these cases where, is that purely ornamental, or was it doing that to achieve some purpose? But going back to the question of program simplification, one of the issues is, given a particular idea, what is the simplest program that represents that idea? The conceit of the language designer is the simplest program will tend to be the correct program. That is, if you've designed your language correctly, the primitives it contains will be such that if your program says it's mostly this tiny little thing, but there are these weird extra cases off at the end, that probably those weird extra cases off at the end are bugs. And that's sort of one of the ways that one can sort of potentially use that kind of self-knowledge, ability to reason about the language itself, is essentially to try and tease out what was the kind of correct, what was the cleanest representation of human intention without bugs and so on. It's a complicated subject. I think it's okay.
Hi, so my question is, it's true that for cellular automata, we can determine exactly where the process is going to be heading during its development life cycle, but wouldn't it be possible to apply shocks to the process during its development trajectory to get the process to move in the direction we want it to, so that while it's evolving, you apply shocks to that system so that it moves to that end state? Like if you want the system to be destroyed, you apply shocks to ensure that with 100% certainty that system will be destroyed after n simulations.
Right, so I mean, the issue is when, how complete do you want your model of a system to be? You can always say, okay, I've got my model, but it's subject to noise from the outside world. It's subject to perturbations from the outside world. But effectively what you're saying when you say that is, I don't have the complete model of the system. I have a model only of some subpart of the system, but there's this extra noise out in the outside world. I view that as being, when you talk about what are the origins of randomness, let's say in fluid turbulence, one case I happen to have studied a bunch. There are basically three possible origins for randomness in fluid turbulence. One is, ultimately there are a bunch of molecules bouncing around, they have a bunch of random kind of heat, and when you see fluid turbulence, it's some amplified version of that underlying microscopic molecular chaos, so to speak. That's one possibility. The other possibility is the kind of the chaos theory explanation, which says it's deterministic dynamics, but there's a detail of the initial conditions which is being kind of progressively excavated as the dynamics goes forward. The third possibility is what I call intrinsic randomness generation, more like Rule 30 or the digits of pi, where it's just the intrinsic process that is going on in the system is generating randomness. And that has various predictions, like it says there should be repeatability in the apparent randomness of the system. And there's some evidence in the Euclidean convection experiments that that's actually true for turbulence. But so when you say, yes, you can get the system to do something by poking the system from the outside, that's certainly true. It's an interesting question how much you can predict what the results of your pokes will be. But in a sense, by saying I'm going to poke it from the outside, you're saying my model is incomplete. I'm going to kind of, I'm going to take, I'm going to say there's something outside. One thing that's sort of ironic in physics right now, there's an increasing realization from studies of sort of quantum information and its relationship to black holes. There's an increasing realization that a very, very, very basic tenet of science may not actually be strictly true. So a very basic tenet of science is you can do independent experiments. That is, you can have a system that is isolated and you can run an experiment on it, and there's one, you can decide what's going to happen in this system, you can decide what's going to happen in another system and run it. But it's becoming increasingly likely that, in the sort of to resolve paradoxes about quantum information and black holes and so on, that at least formally, and it's a little bit of angels on heads of pins here, but a little bit formally, it may be impossible to actually separate out one phenomenon going on in the universe from any other phenomenon going on in the universe. It's kind of, in a sense, at least formally, sort of the end of the idea of Baconian experimental science. And that's sort of an extreme version of this.
So you talked about the irreducibility of some computations and also the irreducibility of history. Do you have a point of view on whether these are the same or different?
So one question is there a theory of history? Can there be a meaningful theory of history? I think that one of the things that's sort of shocking, we've got data now in our language about the borders of historical countries throughout time, right? There are about, a few thousand sort of civilizations that have existed in the course of history. And when you make an animation of all these things, and you see them kind of bubbling around, particularly in Europe, where the borders are fairly well known, the shocking thing is, it looks an awful lot like some kind of physical process. Some empire will get bigger, and it's like a soap bubble, eventually, boom, it collapses. And these are ultimately humans underneath doing all these things, and yet it looks very much like a physical process, and it makes one think, gosh, there must be a theory for this kind of thing. Similarly, one of the things I've always found kind of shocking is, we operate a bunch of production websites and things, so we get terabytes of web analytics data, and so we analyze this stuff. And it used to be the case, actually, the team that originally built this stuff were a bunch of experimental particle physicists that built our early web analytics tools. And what was really interesting was you look at the curves from things like, the Wolfram alpha interquery interval, how long it takes between people making one query and another. You see these curves, and they're very precise curves. And the thing that's kind of shocking is those curves, they raise about the same as in a particle physics experiment, but the curves from humans banging on keyboards are more precise than the curves you get from particle physics experiments. So that's kind of a realization that there do seem to be some kinds of principles of sort of repeatable and understandable principles. But so this question, and again, this question of is there a theory of history? I think there's lots of computational irreducibility, but there is almost inevitably certain computational reducibility, certain patterns that can be analyzed in sort of traditional scientific ways, and about which stories can reasonably be told, so to speak. So but I think it's a very interesting question, the extent to which one can, this is kind of the promise of digital humanities or something, is to try and tease out what we can now, by doing computation, what we can now understand about what regularities there are there. It's very nice that our Wolfram language technology stack seems to be very popular in that whole area, partly because it can analyze lots of stuff, but also it knows a lot of stuff, which is kind of useful if you're interested in things about the world.
First of all, I would like to say that it's an easy one to do. And my question goes back to the previous one, actually. It's about computational irreducibility. If I give you a rule, for A goes to A. We don't have to run the system forever to know what it's going to do. It's going to do nothing. But other rules, you have to run it till. So how can you tell which one is which? And for those which are irreducible, can you actually prove that nobody can tell? Or it's just we still haven't been able to tell?
Oh, okay, so the point about computational irreducibility is nobody can tell. In other words, there are a bunch of footnotes to this which I can go and get very mathematical about, but basically it's the same thing as undecidability. No, it's not the same thing. It's a more finite version of undecidability. Basically, the point of computational irreducibility is if you were going to be able to tell what happens, you effectively have to be in some sense smarter than the system itself. And so you can prove that you can't be smarter than the system itself if you can show that the system itself can emulate any kind of computation. Because among those computations that it can emulate will be the computation that you yourself are doing. And so it therefore follows that you can't jump ahead. So to actually prove that in particular cases, we know particular examples where we can prove computational universality, irreducibility, and so on. It's certainly not the case. The principle of computational equivalence is much bolder and bigger than just talking about the examples we already know. So it's making statements which might be wrong, but it's making a kind of an assertion about the world that says that this is a quite ubiquitous phenomenon. Now, in terms of can you tell, it's an interesting question. Can you predict? I'm almost led to tell a story about a well-known mathematician who's been a long-time user of Mathematica and so on, and who once asked this wonderful, that was the person who proved the unsolvability of Hilbert's 10th problem, which is whether Diophantine integer equations can have solutions. In a very charming moment, he had propagated through this tech support request that basically amounted to, why can't you predict in advance how long these computations are going to take to run? And so the point that I got to make to him was actually his life achievement was to prove that this is impossible. But having said that, it is interesting actually. We just had, so every year we have the summer school that was mentioned in the introduction for adults, and we've also for a few years been having a summer camp for high school kids. Okay, so that just wrapped up a week or so ago now. And one of the projects that I had given to one of the high school kids was the following thing. So there are these things called combinators, which are a kind of simple model of computation that actually predated Turing machines. They come from 1920. They're equivalent to Turing machines. They're rather obscure and abstract. But anyway, you run combinators, and you can ask the question, is the combinator computation going to halt or not? And so this kid, let's see if I can show an example of that. Where is the combinator? Yeah, these are combinators. So these are computations, and they're little things that run, and the question is one of these patterns going to eventually halt or not? Okay? So I suggested, why don't you try using machine learning, because everybody uses machine learning for everything. Why don't you try using machine learning to figure out whether the combinator is going to halt or not? So here's the interesting fact. With about a 90% success rate, this kid could just predict whether the combinator was going to halt. Now, what happens is, so you say, well, okay, so what ends up happening is, there are ones where you can easily say, yeah, it's going to halt, There are ones you can easily prove, no, it's not going to hold. And there's an intermediate case where it's arbitrarily hard to prove whether it holds or not. And that's what happens in general for these things. When you say, does a particular rewrite system, is it going to produce simple behavior or not? There'll be ones where you can easily throw it at the simple behavior bin and the complicated behavior bin. In fact, the confusing thing is that when it comes to asking a question like, is a system computational universal, that very question can be undecidable. So in other words, you can say, yeah, we proved it, or no, we proved it isn't, and then there's an intermediate zone where it's arbitrarily hard to find the proof.
Well, the two last questions here, and I think after we can continue.
I think you might have just answered my question, but this may be a more philosophical version of our question. It's pretty much, can the programmer ask the program to find the nature of itself? And then at that point, who's more intelligent, the programmer or the program?
Right. Well, gosh. You see, that's one of those questions where practically every word one could try and unpack and say, for example, I think a core of that question is the nature of itself. What does one mean by the nature of itself? Do you mean, for example, the rules that it's using? Those are pretty easy to find. Do you mean something about the full spectrum of what it can do? That can be arbitrarily hard. So I'm going to punt on that question, because I claim that question has, that every piece of that question is complicated. So please.
Can I clarify that?
Yeah.
Can I say that it's the nature of itself is the person who dictates the rules? The creator, the nature of itself.
Okay. So that's an interesting question because it relates to questions like, do we live in a simulation? Like, is our universe an intentional creation of something else? Can you tell, for example, whether a thing was made for a purpose? That's a question that's relevant for archaeology. You look at this thing, is it a random collection of rocks, or was that really the critical, altar of some religion or something that we now don't know anything about? So that's a very good question. Can one tell? So, for example, most things one can talk about, like let's say you throw a ball. Okay, one description of what happens when you throw a ball is that there's some equation of motion, and at every moment in time, there's some equation that is determined by momentum, and this and that and the other determines how the ball will go. But it's also the case that there's a least action principle. There's a variational principle in physics that says the trajectory of the ball will be such that it minimizes this integral of Lagrangian of the mechanics of the ball. And that's an explanation that looks much more like it's an explanation by the purpose of the thing than by the mechanism of the thing. And so there's always an interesting interplay of, can you tell the difference between purpose and mechanism? Can you tell whether there is whether a thing that you're presented with, was created, quotes, for a purpose? Now, when usually, in practice, that purpose as I mentioned, there sort of isn't an abstract meaning of purpose, so the only way one gets to talk about that is when one has a kind of thread of connection with whatever entity it is that created that thing. And so I think it's almost a meaningless question, like, is the universe are we living in a simulation? It's like underneath, right down the Planck scale, where there are all these networks going on and so on, we can say, did somebody create those rules for a purpose? Did something create those rules for a purpose? Are those rules created for a purpose? Or are they merely rules that run and make our universe? So I think and I guess, let's see, I was going to make one last comment here. So one of the things that's an extreme version of this, okay, is let's say one is successful and one actually manages to find the rules for our universe. So let's say, I do some big search and, eventually rule number 2118 turns out to be our universe, okay? So we hold in our hand our universe. So what does this mean? Do we then say, oh gosh, I've seen our universe. Now I know, it's very unlikely to have a little signature on it. Certainly not if it's a rule that simple. So the question is, what does it mean if we can sort of hold in our hand our whole universe? It's actually sort of very bizarre because, the lesson of science sort of since the time of Copernicus has been, there's nothing special about us. We keep on being told there's nothing special about us. In fact, this principle of computational equivalence is a big version of there's nothing special about us. So it would then be very bizarre if our universe is universe number 2018, whatever it is, right? It would be very bizarre that we happen to live in a universe that is comparatively simple. Now, you can start saying, well, maybe it only looks simple to us because we're living in this universe. We choose an enumeration scheme such that our universe is simple. I think that argument actually doesn't really work quite. And so it's a very confusing thing to me. If we can actually find, if the universe's rules are simple enough that we can find them, for example, by a search, what does it mean to us when we find them? I have only one hypothesis, which probably isn't correct, but is, usually when one has a problem like that, there's sort of a bizarre answer. I mean, two examples that come to mind from the past are, when Darwin was talking about, biological evolution, saying, well, once there's life has started, then we can go on and do things, but you can't imagine how life would start to begin with. Or similarly, when Newton was talking about the motion of planets, it's like, once the planets are in motion, they can see what happens. And for a long time, it was just very unclear, but now we know that it's sort of inevitable that a star about the size of our sun will end up with a solar system that's about like our solar system. It's something that we can actually compute, rather than it just being, when I was a kid, that was often used as an example of an arbitrary fact about the world, that there are 9 planets, actually now, because there are 8, but back in the day, it was the number of planets is 9 was an example of a random fact about the world that wasn't necessarily true. Now we can compute it. So, okay, so what might be going on in this, we've got a universe that's a very simple universe. Okay, here's my possible hypothesis. So, one of the issues about universes and understanding them is about understanding how observers work in the universe. And in fact, a lot of what's happened in modern physics has been being more realistic about the observer. Like special relativity comes from not imagining that an observer can really know the simultaneity of 2 events. Quantum mechanics from you can't precisely know the position of momentum and so on. So when you make these models of the universe that are just these networks, one of the terrible things is the observer has to be inside that network. You don't get to say, oh, it's a thing outside the system that's observing from the outside. The observer is right inside that network. And that's a very bizarre thing to think about. And in fact, a lot of, for example, the derivation of special relativity of these networks comes from being more realistic about how the observer works inside these networks. Okay, so here's the possible crazy thing that might be true. If you look outside the network, you can see that different rules for the network lead to all kinds of different histories of the universe. But the question of what it is like to an observer inside that universe is much less clear. And one of the bizarre possibilities is that in a large class of universes, from ones with very simple rules to ones with arbitrarily complicated rules, it just could be the case, I'm not saying it is because I haven't figured out how this works, that to any observer built inside those universes, the behavior of that universe looks exactly the same. And that basically there is really only one plausible, rich universe. There are universes where the whole thing has no notion of time, space is limited size or whatever else. There are pathological universes, but as soon as you have a universe that hits this principle of computational equivalence point, that in a sense there is only potentially 2 observers inside that universe, there might only actually be one distinct universe. So okay, that's about as bizarre and abstract as it gets, and that's probably where we should wrap up.